US Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday announced the US would reopen its consulate in Jerusalem and pledged nearly $40 million in aid to Gaza, including $5.5 million in emergency aid, a move that restores US ties with Palestine, which deteriorated during the previous Donald Trump administration. Mr. Blinken is in the Middle East this week to help cement the ceasefire that ended 11 days of violence between Israel and Gaza's militant Hamas forces. The conflict killed more than 250 people, mostly Palestinians, and caused widespread devastation in the already impoverished area. Blinken's trip is not aimed at providing an immediate solution, of course, to the decades-long conflict on statehood, but to stabilize the situation from the latest spark of violence. We discussed the latest developments today with Dr. Avi Shlaim, Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. We're also joined by Hilary Falb Kalisman, Endowed Professor of Israel-Palestine Studies in the Program of Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. And well, let's begin with you, Professor Shlaim. Now, this recent ceasefire, it means that the worst of the violence is over, but the underlying issues that have been festering for decades, they remain just as they were. Do you think there could be smaller steps at this point to maintain the ceasefire and prevent further violence?
So the latest round of fighting between Israel and Hamas is the fourth mini-war since 2008. There was an Israeli assault on Gaza in 2008, again in 2012, again in 2014, and this is the last round of fighting and of violence. So there's been a pattern. Every few years there would be violence, full-scale violence between the two sides. But the violence and the wars don't resolve the underlying problem. The underlying problems have persisted all along. And the underlying problem, the basic problem, is the Israeli occupation. That's the root cause of all the other outbursts of violence and bloodshed. So now another ceasefire has been agreed between Israel and Hamas, but there isn't any possibility, the conditions don't exist for tackling the root causes of the problem. So in answer to your question, what can be done immediately, what small steps might be taken, the answer is that Israel has to take some steps to limit its oppression of the Palestinians. One step it could take is to lift the siege of Gaza. In 2007, Israel imposed a blockade of Gaza, which persists until today and causes untold hardship to the 2 million people in Gaza. A blockade is a form of collective punishment which is prescribed by international law. So this is one step that Israel could take to alleviate the situation. And another step that Israel could take in the immediate future is to stop the Judaization of Jerusalem. The spark for the latest crisis was the raid by an Israeli police force into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holy place for Islam. This happened on the 13th of April and the first day of Ramadan, and it was seen by the Palestinians as an attempt to desecrate the holy place. And the first Hamas rocket attacks weren't fired against Israel until 27 days later. So Israel provoked this crisis. Hamas responded. Another precipitant of this clash was the ethnic cleansing of 6 families from Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood, Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. There is an attempt to drive them out, to ethnic cleanse them, to evict them from their homes, and that was another cause of tension.
So this eviction issue, right? So this eviction issue definitely hasn't been settled, and well, now bringing you into the conversation, Professor Kalisman, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he is in the region this week, and he pledged US support for Palestinians for the suffering they endured and also their recovery, but he said that the aid will not go to Hamas. So do you think this balance will be possible, and what do you think his role at the moment will be in the conflict?
So I think the balance will be extremely difficult, if possible at all. But that said, it seems like he and the Biden administration overall are trying to play a more active role than they have thus far, right? So he's announced, as you mentioned, asking Congress for additional aid to Palestinians. And one of the things that he's emphasized, in contrast with the Trump administration, is that he will avoid unilateral actions. That said, I think one of the tendencies in following the conflict is to focus overmuch on diplomatic relations. One of the most important shifts in terms of US politics is actually the proposal to halt sales of weapons to Israel. And that's happening with Congress, also with Biden staffers. And this is something that hasn't really been thinkable for a long time. So the fact that this is being raised as a question is indicating a real shift in American political discourse.
And now, Professor Shlaim, well, it looks like, Antony Biden, he did make some pledges to help just stabilize the ceasefire in the area. But until now, the Israel-Palestine issue, it didn't really seem to be a high priority agenda in terms of Mr. Biden's foreign policy, with his recent pivot to the Indo-Pacific. And he also has his nuclear talks with Iran to think about, of course. Do you think the ceasefire situation has, in a way, let him off the hook, or do you think he will inevitably have to become a lot more involved? I mean, how far do you think he's willing to go?
President Biden would have preferred not to have to deal with the Israel-Palestine issue because America has tried many times to resolve this issue. The latest round was led by John Kerry in 2014, and no progress was made. The talks collapsed. And President Biden has other issues, other priorities, and he does want to pivot towards Asia. So this crisis was not welcome to him, but his handling of the crisis has been rather disappointing. In many other ways, he's done quite well. He said America is back, human rights are back in American foreign policy agenda. But when the crisis in Israel-Palestine erupted, he instinctively took a pro-Israeli position, and the Security Council 3 times wanted to issue a statement calling for an immediate ceasefire, and 3 times the Americans vetoed that, and they took charge of the backstage negotiations and eventually helped to broker a ceasefire. So America is back to its old tricks. Ever since 1967, America has arrogated to itself a monopoly over the Israel-Palestine peace process, but it failed to push Israel into a settlement. America has excluded Russia, European Union, and most importantly, the United Nations, and kept a monopoly over the diplomacy surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to itself. But it hasn't produced any results. The reason for that is that America is not an honest broker. America is Israel's lawyer. You cannot be both the lawyer and supporter of Israel of one side and be an honest broker with credibility with the Palestinian side. So Biden, to his credit, did get engaged in the conflict, and now America is taking the lead in the reconstruction of Gaza. The trouble is that America doesn't have a realistic policy for achieving a settlement of the underlying conflict, because Biden has reverted to the traditional American policy of a two-state solution, and that's not a viable proposition at the moment. So Biden
there's no
will
denying that. There's no denying that that the U.S. has been dominating the Israeli-Palestine conflict as the broker there, and that's why there seems to be a lot of focus. There has been a lot of focus on the domestic situation in the US, where right now, Professor Shlaim, there seems to be a growing divide within the US Democratic Party itself, between its leadership, the likes of Mr. Joe Biden, and its progressive members like Mr. Bernie Sanders, as well as some of their American Jewish voters. Do you see some of these voices getting louder and the possibility of the US-Israel alliance changing significantly?
I do see that possibility, because the current crisis has been something of a turning point, and the tide is turning against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians all over the world, including Britain, including the United States. And the younger members, more progressive members of the Democratic Party, like the four women senators, they've been much more outspoken in criticizing Israel, in calling for an arms embargo to Israel, and in attaching conditions to American aid to Israel. I think this is very important, because America gives Israel $3.8 billion in military aid a year, and America uses the veto on the Security Council to defeat resolutions that are not to Israel's liking. And the thing about American support for Israel is that it is unconditional. So Israel can do whatever it wants, and it doesn't have to pay a price. Israel gets away literally with murder. And Joe Biden has had throughout his career a consistent pro-Israeli position. And he's always opposed conditioning American aid to Israel, to Israel's observance of international law and observance of Palestinian human rights. And so the change in America, in American politics, may lead America to condition aid to Israel on observing norms of international behavior. And I'll make one last point.
Professor Kalisman, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Do you see the sort of US foreign policy narrative towards the area changing? And also, many have been criticizing both the one-state and the two-state policy as being unrealistic. So what kind of policy you hope to see in going forward from Mr. Biden?
So the thing is, I do think there is a real sea change in American political discourse, in particular making Israel much more of a partisan issue. So it's not just, the Republican Congress inviting Netanyahu to speak in 2015, but it's also because the US is going through its own reckoning about the history of racism. You've had like a lot of long, hard work by activists within the US comparing the structural racism of the way the US works to Israel. And because of changes in US political discourse, you're now seeing changes in how particularly more progressive democratic policymakers are speaking about Israel. And again, even suggesting conditions on that relationship, even if it's going to be very difficult for that to come into play, as Professor Shlaim mentioned, that's still a big step. So in terms of a possible solution, so this is a bit above my pay grade, but I would say it points to some of the contradictions inherent in the founding of the State of Israel. So on the one hand, the goal was to create a Jewish majority state, which would serve as a national homes for Jews worldwide, even ones who were not yet citizens. On the other hand, Israel's Declaration of Independence asserts that everyone should be treated equally under the law, regardless of religion. The problem is, how do you then maintain a Jewish majority, again, seeing Jews worldwide as citizens, while still supposedly treating 20% of Israel's internal population and about 50% of the population under Israel's control equally? And so I think up until now, Israel's governments have kind of tried to pass the buck, to sweep the problem under the rug, to really hope that Palestinians would kind of be quiet, give up, and that's not going to work as a long-term solution. So I think really any of the solutions is going to have to reckon with the basis of the state itself.
And well, this is a discussion that needs to go on for much longer, but I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to end today's interview. That was Dr. Avi Shlaim, Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Hilary Falb Kalisman, Endowed Professor of Israel-Palestine Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.